jaysanalysis.com. We return with the discussion about minds, machines, and Gödel, and logic and the absolute. So we're going to be getting into some pretty heavy philosophical territory today. I want to go ahead and tell you from the outset that these might be a little bit difficult, but they're not undoable. You can do them. I'm going to try to make the ideas that we're talking about here palatable to an audience, yet at the same time not be too watered down. So if you've followed along with the previous discussions, it'll tie into the talks that we've had with Plato, different metaphysical talks I've done, and the last talk which dealt with atheism, God's existence, and so forth. So this is going to be in the same vein, but we're going to touch on some of the insights that we get from Gödel and from Philip Sherrard, because I see a fascinating parallel between these two scholarly essays. I'm not sure who the author is on this first one. It lists different names. Maybe there's different authors, but this is apparently a well-cited article on minds, machines, and Gödel, which I will link. And we're going to go through and hit the highlights and figure out what he's saying, and then look at the Sherrard essay on Platonism and the problems for Platonism, the reasons for his not accepting outright Platonism and preferring Christian theology. And then we're going to look at how this relates to last week's talk with God's existence, and see if we can get a good picture of the problems for materialism, for the idea that we can just create a computer analog of the human. I apologize, my allergies are going crazy today, so bear with me. Is the mind just a blank slate that we can program? Are humans just biological robots? And can a perfect analog be created in terms of artificial intelligence? So these are all hot topics, of course. And with transhumanism being the dominant force behind where the global elites are trying to take us in terms of a new religion, I think this is going to have a lot of relevance given everything else that I write about at Jay's Analysis. So strap yourselves in. Maybe that's not the best salvo to start with, because that implies that this is going to be a wild ride. But I guess for us nerds, it will be a wild ride. So we're going to also talk about transcendental arguments and how that applies, because there's an interesting parallel between Gödel's theorem and transcendental arguments. So let's start with this essay, Minds, Machines, and Gödel. So in this first essay, the author is trying to demonstrate that there's never going to be a machine that perfectly matches up to the human mind and consciousness. And he's going to show that by using Gödel's theorems. So if we think about Gödel's theorems, we're immediately presented with, just to boil this down to something really obvious, that there, for any set of axioms or any numeric set, if we were to take the set as a whole, there's always going to be some truth that is provable but is not part of the set itself. So the set at some point as a whole will have to appeal outside of itself. And there will always be some indeterminate aspect of the set that, again, is true, but yet not part of the set itself. And so Gödel had some debates back in the day with Bertrand Russell over this, and it kind of shook the mathematic world. But I'm one of those who believes that there are implications that go far beyond just merely mathematical sets, as opposed to those who want to restrict this to only being something true about formal mathematical or logical systems. But if you study philosophy and metaphysics, philosophy of science, you can see how this has implications across the board, because it also applies to humans, and this essay is going to get into how that's the case. How does Gödel's theorem apply beyond just abstract math to something concrete? And the author's going to use the example of robotics or artificial intelligence to try to demonstrate that in the same way that there's an indeterminate aspect to the human person that goes beyond just merely being incorrect. In other words, we're not just a determined mechanistic machine that's going to always do X, Y, Z in this or that situation. There's an indeterminate aspect to us that distinguishes us from machines, and one way we know that is because we can see the truth of Gödel's theorem, whereas any machine that's created that you input this data into, it can always give the correct calculation in some algorithm or some function, but it can never see the truth of the fact that there's a truth outside of that system. You see what I'm saying? So if we had some set of numbers, some big long set, doesn't matter, there will always be something true that pertains to the set that goes outside of the set itself, and therefore is indeterminate, but nevertheless true. So this has kind of been floating around in philosophy for a long time. We could think of the history of Greek philosophy, and there were philosophers who posited things like, this sentence is false. Okay, so there's kind of a paradox there, because if we read the sentence and accept it, we're automatically caught in a kind of a loop where we don't know what to do, because even though the sentence grammatically, syntax and so forth can be correct, if we accept it as true, we're also accepting the truthfulness of the statement, that the statement itself is false. This is not a contradiction. It's a paradox, and this is an example of how there's a distinction between a contradiction and a paradox. There's nothing inherently contradictory in that sentence or in that phrase, because it's indeterminate. We can't know if that is actually the case or not the case, right? So mathematical examples of this can be given in terms of telling a printer print and not print. So the machine's only going to do, depending on how the machine's programmed, maybe to do the first command that was input or the last command that was input, right? So the machine's not going to be able to determine what the correct answer is when it's given two conflicting commands. So it's only going to be able to do what it's programmed to do. Nevertheless, there's not necessarily a true answer between print and not print. It just depends. So a lot of people have given all kinds of different examples of how Gödel's incompleteness theorems apply, to machines and computers and so forth. And we'll get into some of that, but I think as we go through this, it might become clearer. I also recommend, it's not easy, but for more advanced readers and probably people more advanced than me, there's Douglas Hofstadter's book, Gödel, Escher, Bach, which really fleshes out how what Gödel talked about applies to things across the board. So we see this exemplified in M.C. Escher's art, And we see it in things like Box-Rissercar composition, which has this self-contained loop to it. And in order to, it's not as if the positions within the loop are false, but it's rather that we're always kind of stuck in this unless we have some higher, something higher to appeal to step outside the loop and then to conceptually or abstractly consider the loop itself, right? So this would apply to anything, the geometric formations of Escher's art, the programs that we put into a computer, software programs, the way it's written. There are truths that cannot be proved within the system itself, and that does not mean that the limitations of the axioms or the system are therefore false. And that's kind of what the key point here is. But rather, there are also metaphysical implications, I'm going to argue, that go beyond merely abstract formal math. And this is where we get into the realm of theology and philosophy. So the author says, Gödel's theorem must apply to cybernetical machines because it is of the essence of being a machine that it should be a concrete instantiation of a formal system. It follows that any given machine which is consistent and capable of doing some arithmetic, there is a formula which is incapable of producing as being true. The formula is unprovable in the system which can be seen to be true. It follows that no machine can be a complete or adequate model of the mind, and that minds are essentially different from machines. So the argument here is kind of what I've been saying, that there will be truths that will go beyond the system itself. One of those truths is Gödel's theorem itself. And we know that Gödel's theorems are true, and yet we cannot translate this perfectly into any mathematical or arithmetical formula or any kind of algorithm that we or code that we would put into a machine, because we can always raise it up one level more. And so even if you rewrite your code to take that into account, it can always be raised to a higher level yet again. So ad infinitum on into infinity. So there will always be something that the mind can do that a programmed machine can't do. So the author is going to get into objections to this argument and try to show how those objections don't hold. He says the Gödelian formula is the Achilles heel of the cybernetic machine, and therefore we cannot ever hope to produce a machine that will be able to do all that a mind can do. We can never, not even in principle, have a mechanical model of the mind. However complicated a machine we construct, it will, if it is a machine, correspond to a formal system, which in turn will be liable to the Gödel procedure for finding a formula unprovable in that system. This formula the machine will be unable to produce as being true, although a mind can see that it is true. And so the machine will still not be an adequate model of the mind. We are trying to produce a model of the mind which is mechanical, essentially that it is dead, but the mind, being in fact alive, can always go one better than any formal ossified dead system. Thanks to Gödel's theorem, the mind always has the last word. And so he's saying that the mind can see that Gödel is right in his theorems proves that the mind is not a mechanistic material machine that is purely subject to deterministic formal or deterministic natural processes. And so I pointed this out before. This in philosophy or theology is known as the deterministic fallacy. And this would say, if we adopt the mechanistic, Darwinistic, strictly, chemical, biological view in a reductionistic fashion of the natural world, then what we're left with is determinism. And many modern thinkers who adopt this view are, adamant determinists. They think that every action that we engage in is actually predetermined according to a strict series of chain of causal determinations. So you're just doing what your biological programming and the chemical reactions in your brain and body are causing you to do. The choice that you believe you have is more of a mental fiction. It's a mental illusion. Now, the problem, of course, with the deterministic fallacy, which is a very easy one to refute, is that you can never know if this is true. Why? Well, because your discovery of the deterministic fallacy is also merely part of your illusory determined process. Right? So the discovery that you think you've made of the truth of determinism is illusory. It was merely what you were determined to discover by natural processes that have nothing to do with a self-conscious agent. So that is, of course, self-contradictory, refuted nonsense. Nevertheless, it's something that moderns hold dear as a dogma. But to get back to the paper, we can see that he presents an interesting first argument here that the machine will always be like that. All right? The machine's always going to be like the kind of thing that the naturalists and the determinists think everything is. And so I heard, I think it was Alan Watt gave a talk where he made a good point that others have made in the past that I've read, that men tend to view everything like whatever their latest fascination is. And so because the computer is kind of the great invention and idol of our era, it's only natural that humans want to then view everything like the computer. Everything is put into this model, so the simulation, the simulacrum is replaced for the reality, and we have this idolatrous, weird view that because we've created computers, well then that must be the sum total metaphysical explanation for everything, and so we get these ideas that the universe is a hologram. We're living inside a computer simulation. This has come out in the last few years as the dominant new idea in physics and quantum physics and so forth. Now, I'm not saying that everything about that theory is false, because I think what they discover is kind of just the substructure of reality itself. So I don't think that reality is an illusion, which this view would hold, and ultimately this view, finds connect with Platonism, and we're going to get into why that's problematic in a bit with Sherrard's essay. But suffice to say, at this point, this is just men adopting a model. And Daniel Dennett has papers on this that I've read where he is very strict in his determinism and arguing that humans are just computers, more advanced biological computers. But again, the central refutation of this is simply to say that, well, if that's true, you could never know it, and it's self-contradictory. Because your discovery of it is just a determined process. So, back to the essay, he says, in a sense, just because the mind has the last word, it can always pick a hole in a formal system presented to it as a model of its own workings. The mechanical model must be, in some sense, finite and definite, and then the mind can always go one better. So there's always this potentiality for consciousness, for the mind to step up, right, to go beyond the determined process of what the machine is doing. And this is itself a very good indicator, evidence for consciousness, as opposed to people like Dennett who want to stamp out consciousness, or Russell or Alan Turing. These are hard materialists who think that progress is contained in the idea of stamping out the psyche and the soul. The theorem is exemplified, the second theorem is exemplified in the phrase, it is impossible to prove in a consistent system that system is consistent. And it really is that simple. And that's because you will always need to appeal outside of that system for some system-wide proof, right? So because the system is dealing with the system, if you're to ask, is the system itself true or consistent, the system can't ever demonstrate that. And so in the same way, I've applied this many times to metaphysics when we ask the question of, if we say, the question of, say, naturalism or materialism, you're never going to, if you have that view of the world, you can never prove that view of the world is correct, because all you're ever going to get from the natural world is some other kind of image of the natural world. So if, in other words, imagine all reality collapsed into one type of thing, monism. Sorry, so it's all just atoms, it's all just matter. So everything can be conceptualized or formalized or collapsed into one type of thing. And in philosophy, this is called monism. And it doesn't really matter what kind of thing, because some people are idealistic monists. They think that everything is at base just idea. That would be Platonism. And some people are materialistic monists. They think that at base everything is just matter. Regardless, either one of these these worldviews collapses all of reality isomorphically into the same type of thing. And so what that means is that distinctions are ultimately imposed or illusory. So the idea that I'm distinct from you, or that chairs are distinct from couches and popcorn is distinct from candy, that's all illusory. Everything is ultimately just the same thing, just in different shapes and forms. Regardless, everything is one thing. So if we have that view of the world, you can never ever get outside of that. And it's that simple. That's what I'm getting at, right? So there's, because anything that you appeal to, any idea that you have, any thesis that you have, is all still part of merely this one type of thing. And it's just, again, for most of these people, just a determined chemical reaction. The ideas that you have, the truths that you supposedly think you're discovering, they're not really truths. They're just determined chemical processes that you are deluded into thinking are true propositions or truths about the world. They're not actually true, and you'll never ever know if they're true. They're just some sort of chemical reaction process going on in your head that you are deluded into thinking is true. Now, this is the ultimate absurdity of where these positions lead. They pass themselves off as being these, grand, complex, rational theories, but they are at base completely irrational, and that's the tension in the atheist worldview. A cosmos that is ultimately chaotic and irrational, but yet for him must at every point be completely rational and explained. This is the nonsense and incoherence of that worldview. So he's going to deal with an objection, the author, where somebody says, well, sounds like what you're saying is that you're making an argument for consciousness from the fact that humans are fallible and we do strange things and indeterminate things, and so because we can't always be predictable, then maybe all we have to do is write a computer program that is unpredictable. And he gives an interesting dialogue and discussion with that weird argument, because that's not really what's being said here. The argument's not that humans are merely predictable, and then so therefore consciousness. That would be a non sequitur. But he's looking at indicators. He's saying, well, this is something that's different, between a mind and a machine, and it's not just being random or being indeterminate. Because even if you write a program for a computer to say be random between 2, 3, 4, 5, 20 options, you still programmed into the machine that finite number of options, right? So it's still not answering the question, and it's still a determined process within the program. And it's still not the same thing as the mind, because it's still a finite set of limited axioms or options. Even if you program, even if you spend your whole life programming a bunch of different indeterminate options, it's still a determinate number of options. So he says, in terms of human minds, this is surely a characteristic of the mental operations of human beings. They are selective, they discriminate, they choose between true and false, and when a person is prepared to say anything and is prepared to contradict himself without any qualm or repugnance, he is judged to be crazy, or he has lost his mind. Human beings, although not perfectly consistent, are not so much inconsistent as they are fallible. So he's making a distinction between merely making an error and, consistently choosing to be inconsistent. A fallible but self-correcting machine would still be subject to Gödel. That's the point here. Only a fundamentally inconsistent machine would escape, but a fundamentally inconsistent machine, of course, would not work very well. So that argument is not a very good argument, he says. We should try to formulate anew our intuitive concept of number as we have our intuitive concept of a set. If we did this, we should, of course, recast our system. Our present axioms and rules of inference would be utterly rejected. There would be no question of our using and not using them in an inconsistent fashion. We should, once we have recast the system, be in the same position as we are now, possessed of a system believed to be consistent, but not provably so. And I just have my own question with this phrase. Now, if this applies to whole numbers themselves, whole numbers are infinitely divisible. So if we can infinitely divide whole numbers, it seems to me that the Gödel question applies everywhere. So it's not just a set of axioms, but it would ultimately apply to any infinite set. And so since a whole number could be divided infinitely, it has the potential to be an infinite set. And if it's an infinite set, then we are at the kind of point that Cantor made, that there are multiple infinities. So if there's multiple infinities, then there are infinities of infinities, because you can always raise a set to a higher level of infinity, or just raise it one, and then raise that set to one, right? And then that set of raising can ultimately be an infinite set, and then that set can be raised. So this never ends, and so infinity is present at every point. And in my mind, that would seem to suggest that Gödel's theorem doesn't just apply to a bunch of algorithms that we put into a machine, but it would apply to numbers themselves. And that seems to be what the author's kind of hinting at, but I'm not really sure, because he doesn't go on to flesh that idea out. He says, we can see how we might almost have expected Gödel's theorem to distinguish self-conscious beings from inanimate objects. The essence of the Gödelian formula is that it is self-referring. It says that the formula is unprovable in the system. When carried over into a machine, the formula is specified in terms which depend on the particular machine in question. The machine is being asked a question about its own processes. And that's key. That's what the machine will never be able to transcend. We are asking it to be self-conscious and say things it can and cannot do. Such questions are notoriously paradoxical, right? So it'd be like asking Siri, what are all the things that you can't do? Right? Well, she doesn't know about them, right? So she can't respond. So at one's first and simplest attempts to philosophize, one becomes entangled in questions of whether or not, whether one knows something one knows and what it doesn't know. and when one is thinking of oneself is being thought about and what is doing the thinking. So this is all the canard of the idea of the computers becoming sentient and self-conscious, which is stupid, because the only people who believe that are the people who believe that consciousness itself is illusory and just a determined chemical process, neurons firing, right? So if we can just create a computer that has all the same on and off switches in terms of electricity, well then it's the same thing as the mind, right? So it'd be like me saying the penny with Abraham Lincoln on it is the same as Abraham Lincoln because it's the same Abraham Lincoln. Right? Well, no, they're two different things, right? They have similarities, but the only way to make them the same is to collapse all of reality into one type of thing. That's tremendously problematic. Continuing, the author says, after one has been puzzled and bruised by this problem for a long time, one learns not to press the questions. The concept of a conscious being is implicitly realized to be different from that of an unconscious object. In saying that a conscious being knows something, we are saying not only that he knows it, but that he knows that he knows it. And that he knows that he knows that he knows it, and so on. As long as we care to pose the question we recognize an infinity here. But it is not an infinite regress in the bad sense, for it is the questions that peter out as being pointless rather than the answers. The questions are felt to be pointless because the concept contains within itself the idea of being able to go on answering such questions indefinitely. Although conscious beings have the power of going on, we do not wish to exhibit this simply as a succession of tasks that they are able to perform. Nor do we see the mind as an infinite sequence of selves and superselves and super-superselves. Rather, we insist that a conscious being is a unity. And though we talk about the parts of the mind, we do so as a metaphor, and we do not generally take it to be literal. Kant called this the transcendental unity of apperception, and that's that we can't prove that our consciousness and its perceptions are unified by any empirical data or evidence. We merely assume that it is so, and with good reason. And this is another good example of a transcendental argument is the unity of apperception. So the ability of the mind to perceive things and to coherently do this over time and to form patterns and to have the ability to recognize identity in objects in the world over time. That book that's there today on my desk is the same book tomorrow on the desk. Has all the same features, all the same pages, all the same color properties and so forth. So the ability of the mind over time to do this is not something that we can empirically demonstrate. It's just something that appears to be the case. Humans are so constituted such that our mind perceives objects and their identities over time. And so this is a transcendental argument, because to deny it would be to deny the very ability to perceive objects at all. And so we would immediately be lost in complete incoherence and nothing would have any meaning. And then therefore the denial of the transcendental unity of apperception presupposes the truth of the transcendental unity of apperception. So this is again, he's hinting at a Kantian type of transcendental argument. Again, I'm not supporting Kant because Kant is full of problems. I'm just merely looking at the transcendental argument. Well, let's cut and paste that out of Kant, okay? Because that's something that I think is a valid argument on its own. It has nothing to do with whether the totality of Kant's philosophy is correct or not, because it is not. Kant ultimately ends up being an empiricist, but a kind of solipsistic idealist empiricist in a way, and that's a dead-end philosophy, as is Kantianism and the idea of separating the mind from being able to perceive natures and essences in the world in terms of realism. So Kant is a divorce from classic realist metaphysics, and so that's not a road we want to go down. But again, this argument itself is a great argument. How could we prove that our perceptions are unities, are unified? By the fact that denying that would lead to absurdities and still assumes the truth of it, right? Because let's say I wanted to deny the unity of my perception over time in order to use Kant's argument, in order to affirm that was false, I would still be relying on past perception of things that I've learned. So my learning in the past about true and false would be presupposed in the act of denying the unity of my perception, and to deny the unity of my perception would then call into question my learning of true and false in the past. See? So it's nonsense. But it's a great argument in terms of a transcendental argument. And again, what is a transcendental argument? Well, it's not exactly the same thing as something a priori. That's just, in classic, in modern formal logic, that's, the idea of something like knowing something apart from empirical perception. And so that's not exactly what we're saying with the transcendental argument, because we're not just simply saying that, we know an unmarried male is a bachelor. That's an analytic proposition. We're not just saying something a priori, that 2 is the number 2 or 2 plus 2 is 4. We're going beyond that. We're saying that there are certain categories of things or certain types of things that are necessary for cognition or for being or for science or for life even as a whole, that cannot be empirically proven but can be proven in an indirect way, by an indirect form of argumentation. So that's what we're saying with a transcendental argument. And one of those things, for example, is the unity of our perception over time. And there's absolutely no way to prove this with empirical data, because I can't go and put my mind under a microscope and see if it sees correctly over time. Likewise, I can't put somebody else's mind and their thoughts under a microscope and see for sure that they are perceiving the same objects over time. At this point, we're not able to do that. I think maybe DARPA can get a vague image of different thoughts from fMRI, scans the brain, but they're not able yet to completely empirically perceive someone else's perception. I mean, even the fMRI scan of someone else's thought is still an image. It's not the actual thought. So, getting off track, but you see the point I'm getting at here is that even if it's just so outlandish to think that we're going to create, a sentient, self-conscious, artificial intelligence when we don't even really have any way to demonstrate or prove what human intelligence and consciousness or psyche is, right? So that's why this is such a hot debate, and why a lot of these guys are so dogmatic about their materialism, is that we don't know. It's still mysterious. And I mean, the Bible even says, Paul says in one of his epistles, who knows the spirit of a man, who knows what's in a man but the spirit of, who knows the spirit of a man but the spirit of God, right? So we don't even know the depths of our own spirit, soul, psyche, much less how to, create a robot version of this. Turing is suggesting, let me go back up to this, he talks about Alan Turing, and Turing, of course, came to the fore with the rise of computer science. This is a different article. I'll put this up. Turing's 1936 paper on the on computable real numbers marks an epistemological break between idealism and materialism in math. Prior to Turing, it was hard to get away from the idea that through mathematical reason, the human mind gained access to a higher realm of or domain of Platonic truths. Turing's first proposal for a universal computing machine is based on an implicit rejection of this view. Actually, Turing was not the first person to propose a universal computing machine. Leibniz was. His machine is intended to model what a human mathematician does when calculating or reasoning, and by showing what limits this machine encounters, he identifies constraints which bind mathematical reasoning in general. So this is a different article by Paul Cockshott, who is a Oxford Fabian socialist who, we already know what he's all about, right? So Oxford Fabian socialism. And naturally, Turing, Russell would be heroes to this kind of guy, because Turing was a materialist, also homosexual, and I don't mean to bring in ad hominems here, but I think it's important to realize that people's motivations for why they believe things and do things is not always logical, and this is the case even for highly logical people. No human is able to be completely objective and robotic and not influenced by desires. So the point I'm getting at is that for a lot of these transhumanist materialist types, they're part of a certain clique. They're part of a certain worldview, and that clique, that worldview, is very much dominated by, Fabian socialist dysgenics, not even eugenics. Eugenics is old school, done with, and so the transhumanist ethos, which is to evolve out of this older materialism, is very important for understanding where all of this is going. Okay, so all this AI stuff, Turing, materialism, these aren't things happening in a vacuum. They're all connected because they're all part of the same Royal Society agenda of where they want to take everybody. And that's, it's the Huxleys that coined the term transhumanism. It's the Huxleys that talk about creating Brave New World. So, again, very much by design. And that's why this stuff matters so much. Turing suggests that it is only a matter of complexity, right? So for Turing, consciousness is not soul or psyche, it's just a matter of levels of complexity. And that above a certain level of complexity, a qualitative difference appears. So that supercritical machines will be quite unlike the simple ones. Okay, but, again, this doesn't solve the question, right? So this is from a person who's already committed in his presuppositions, I'm speaking of Turing here, to materialism. So it doesn't matter what problems there are, it's a presuppositional commitment, right? Now maybe he does, I haven't read all his work, so maybe he tries to deal with this. I know that one of my professors in my undergrad, my philosophy of science professor, was a committed dogmatic Darwinian materialist, and his whole life was centered around trying to solve the question of consciousness. Well, you're never going to do it, buddy. Sorry. Number one, you're not going to do it because you're committed to materialism. So what happens is, in other words, a lot of these guys end up being committed to proving what they want to be the case. That's what I'm trying to get at. How do I know that? Well, because I debated this guy publicly, and the argument that I gave against materialism is the same argument that I gave earlier about, determinism and so forth, right? So this guy, if I recall, was an adamant opponent of free will. So if everything was determined, then his discovery of materialism was also determined, right? And so therefore not an objectively true thing or an objectively true belief about the world. It was a determined chemical process in his mind. And again, there's no way to answer that problem as a materialist, and that's why these guys spend their whole careers, academic careers, trying to solve this dilemma, which they will never solve because they don't have any humility about what man is and man's place in the universe. They are worshippers of their own minds and intellects. So, the author goes on to say, what is at stake in the mechanist debate is not how minds are or might be brought into being, but how they operate. It is essential for the mechanist thesis that mechanical models of the mind shall operate according to mechanical principles. So he goes on to say that even if we did create a machine that appeared to operate with some indeterminacy and randomness, it would still not be the same thing as the mind, because it's never going to be able to recognize, that it's a machine operating as a machine, and it's never going to achieve self-consciousness, because self-consciousness within a determinate fixed system, again, like the Gödelian theorem, it never has the ability to step outside of its enclosed system. And so materialism as a monistic worldview is never able to get outside of materialism. That's the point. So the author, after making some really good points and arguments, and of course I've added a lot of my own in this talk, concludes with that the proof of the falsity of mechanism, this mechanistic view, is of the greatest consequence for the whole of philosophy. It is of the greatest consequence. Since the time of Newton, the bogey of mechanist determinism has obsessed philosophers. Exactly, that's what I've been getting at. If we were to be scientific, it would seem that we must look on human beings as determined automata and not as autonomous moral agents. If we were to be moral, it seemed that we must deny science its due, set an arbitrary limit to its progress in understanding human neurophysiology, and take refuge in obscurantist mysticism. No, not true. Not even Kant could resolve the tension between these two standpoints. Well, so it's not as if Kant is like the final word on this or something, like he's the greatest pinnacle of this question. No, he's not. But now, even though many arguments against human freedom remain, the argument for mechanism, perhaps the most compelling, has lost its power. Well, that's true, right? But we didn't just need this argument using Gödel, because the argument from the determinist fallacy is a stronger argument, which this guy doesn't even reference it. But he does make a good point here that, as I've made in the past, that Newtonian atomism, even though Newton was kind of, weirdo hermeticist himself and had all these esoteric views, the aspect of his thought which has come to still dominate is, causal determinism, mechanistic determinism. Just, viewing everything as a machine. So, this view just will not go away. And this guy wrote this paper in the 60s, And this view has even grown since then, right? So we have all the new atheists, and the new atheists tend to promote this as well. Like I said, Daniel Dennett, his papers talk about man as an advanced robot, completely determined. Because why? Because obviously materialism is true. So these guys just don't even accept, arguments that oppose the position because they're dogmatic presuppositional commitments. So, my notes here. The idea of how these guys think is, the mind is a tabula rasa. It's programmable with input and output like a computer, and so therefore we'll just make a computer with input and output, and therefore it's a human mind. And all these movies, that's all these dumb movies, are all funded to promote all this same stuff. And so the mechanical model of the world that comes out of Descartes and Newton is then translated into the all-encompassing grand narrative explanation for man. Man is the grand narrative, and we're supposed to be supposedly done with grand narrative explanations of the world, but as you can see, Darwinism, neo-Darwinism, transhumanism, scientism, mechanism, these are all still grand narratives, right? The great computer, God, is going to save us. The Red Queen, Skynet is our God, she will save us. Viewing everything like our latest creation, right? That's what I'm saying. So we all like video games now. Well, we must live in a big computer simulation hologram. We're in Resident Evil, I guess, apparently. So what systems analysis does, which is what we've kind of been doing here, what Gödel's looking at, the same principle or pattern of the systems analysis that Gödel is doing with formal logic and math is the same thing that I'm doing across the board with all of these philosophical ideas. See? So we can do this same systems analysis with worldviews or with different metaphysical principles, and that's the transcendental argument that I've been talking about. And there are a bunch of transcendental arguments, and like I said in the previous talk, when we bundle them all together, we can ask an even higher level meta question. Well, what holds all these other transcendental arguments together? How is there a unity of metaphysics and epistemology and anthropology and physics such that the world works in the way that we experience it? And this, in my mind, constitutes an excellent argument. And so I think, for God, I think that what Gödel is doing is presenting a formal mathematical logical version of a transcendental argument as applied to set theory, but it's the same argument as I'm presenting. Right? I'm just applying it into different fields. Now, a lot of mathematicians had this Indian dude who was taking issue with this point and more in the materialist frame, and he was very furious about me saying that what Gödel's doing applies across the board. Well, Roger Penrose has a debate with a guy that's over this very question where he agrees with me that Gödel's principles apply far beyond just formal math and numerals, prime numbers. So the article that we've just cited here, Minds, Machines, and Gödel, I think proves that. It puts forth several strong arguments to show that Gödel's principles do not just apply to formal math, but they also apply to real-world things such as trying to build a computer that is a cyborg or artificial intelligence. It applies across the board in the things that Gödel, Escher, and Bach talks about. Hofstadter's book, right? The principle applies to things like things like music, compositions, Bach's Risserkar, and the art of M.C. Escher. And it also applies to philosophy. So that's where I come in, and I'm telling you that the things that Hofstadter applied to Escher and Bach, I'm applying to philosophy and metaphysics, and it's ultimately still just the same argument. And although it sounds very obtuse, obscure, difficult, it's actually not that difficult. It's the same argument. It's very simple, and it's just simply that without God, the preconditions for knowledge, the preconditions for metaphysics, the preconditions for perceiving the world, the preconditions for the self to exist over time, identity over time. Again, list them all, list as many as you want, transcendental arguments. Precondition for these transcendental arguments to work is God himself, right? And that is an argument. It might take a little bit of thinking and contemplating before it kind of becomes evident as to how that's an argument. But again, it's like the argument with the transcendental unity of perception. The transcendental unity of perception says that our perception of things over time is unified and coherent and in some way meaningful. And we cannot empirically prove that. Well, if we can't empirically prove it, how do we know that it's true? Well, it's true by the impossibility of the contrary, because denying it still affirms it and proves and assumes it, right? So this is similar to the sentence, the idea of the sentence, "This is false." "This is false" is a grammatically correct sentence, but it's a paradox, and we have to go outside of that sentence to try to figure out what's going on here, right? Whether it's true, whether it's false, what's going on here. It's indeterminate. So in the same way, anything within some system, be it set theory, be it a philosophical worldview or system, we want to look for consistency, inconsistency, indeterminacy, and then the preconditions for how it's possible. How is it even possible for this philosophical system or mathematical system to be the case, right? So it's just a higher level question. It's a meta level question, right? So if we want an analogy, we think of meta narrative, think of Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a play about a play, right? It's a movie about making movies, right? There are many examples of this meta narrative. A film about how films are made. So it's a higher level. It's stepping up, right? Or stepping down, however you want to conceive the analogy. Doesn't matter. Same principle. It's the same idea as thinking about thinking, right? I'm conscious of being in this room, but I'm also able to be conscious of myself as a conscious being in this room, right? And it sounds like wordplay, sounds silly, but there's actually an important philosophical point in this, and that's what we're getting at. So this article also shows, I might add, that science is very much based on philosophy and metaphysics, right? So this is a great on-the-ground example of how something like AI involves philosophy, and it involves mathematics, involves a bunch of stuff that's not empirically directly perceivable. So again, this should be obvious, but scientism is just the dogmatic religion of our day, and no one can question it. You're not allowed to consider the possibility that science is based on philosophy and the philosophy of science, because Neil deGrasse Tyson said so. He says philosophy is useless. We have science, so that solves all these debates, all these questions. So you can throw out this whole essay here that makes all these great arguments, minds, machines, and Gödel, because Neil deGrasse Tyson said it doesn't matter. So now we're going to move to the question of how this relates to Platonism and the Philip Sherrard essay, Logic and the Absolute. So this is going to come home we're going to tie this together, and we're going to see how it's related to the excellent essay by Philip Sherrard. And I had questions from readers as to, okay, so you made all these points. We've been going through the Platonic dialogues, and you referenced the idea of there being problems in Plato. What are your problems with Platonism? So we're going to get into that in the next half and tie all this together. So the first half, as you probably know now, is free to the public and those who like Jay's analysis. The second half of this talk will be for paid subscribers. And what I do is every week I do a podcast, a talk relating to philosophy, comparative religion, theology, etc. And you get this sent to you in a private email, so you can have your own private education that is university level, free from Marxist, feminist indoctrination, which you would get at most of the state public schools, and even now private schools are now tainted with this through the Rockefeller-controlled educational standardization plan that's been in the works for so long. So if you want to move in the direction of a classical education, then what I do is I offer lectures in differing levels of advanced to beginner in terms of philosophy and metaphysics, which metaphysics just isn't even taught anymore. So it's a discarded treasure. But as I point out in many articles, metaphysics is actually the real science, the real essence of how the alternative system that the elites work on and how they make these great advancements. They're doing an alternative version of these things. So as we move on to the Logic and the Absolute by Sherrard, we're going to delve into the question of Platonism and theology. And Sherrard has some really, really amazing insights when it comes to boiling this down to the central difference between the approach of the Platonist and the approach of the Christian theologian, both of whom affirm logic, but give logic a different place. Sherrard says, the question at issue between the Platonists and the theologians does not therefore concern the nature of logic itself or how it must be used when it is used. It concerns only the relationship between the logical order and the metaphysical order. The arguments of the Platonists we have seen depend upon accepting as true the idea that there is an adequation of the two orders. This does not mean that for the Platonists the order of logic coincides with the metaphysical order, but it means that the order of logic on its own level mirrors the structure of the metaphysical order, so that the laws of logic not only derive from, but also analogically may be applied to the metaphysical order. In other words, when metaphysical reality is reflected on the logical plane of the human mind, the concepts it forms of itself will be, or at least in principle should be, logically consistent and non-contradictory, because the Platonists affirm, ultimately, nothing in the nature of this reality is opposed to the principle of logical consistency and non-contradiction. It is for this reason that the Platonists feel quite justified in applying the laws of logic to their representations of the metaphysical realm, and why they claim that there can, in the nature of things, be no doctrine that is beyond logical explanation. So what we have here is that Platonism, and Sherrard makes clear that he's including Neoplatonism in this broad category of Platonism, is the ultimate sort of form of rationalism. And Christian theology is not rationalist in its approach. Christian theology is rational. And there's a big difference here, because we believe that paradox and mystery are acceptable. And there will always be a degree of paradox and mystery because we're finite creatures. So even in what we call the eschaton, or the final state, we move on, the resurrection and so forth, will still be finite. And so even though we'll be participating in the blessings of God, we'll have eternal life and so forth, we will always be learning God in a perpetual progress, but we'll never attain the complete fullness of divinity. And that's because we won't partake of the indefinable, indescribable attributes of God, like omniscience. We'll always be finite, so we'll never have omniscience, because to take on that property would be to take on something that is particular to God himself. So there will always be a distinction between the creature and the creator, even as God raises us to higher levels of existence. So for the Platonists, though, there's not a distinction between creature and creator. There's also not a creator. So reality as we experience is a gradation of being, or a gradation of emanations from the one. And so there's not an exact coherence between the multiplicity or the lower levels of being that we inhabit and the ultimate form of being that the one has. There's an analogical, mirrored reality that is sort of reflected all the way down these different levels of being, these different levels of emanations, if you will. But they are still accurate mirrors of the one. And so the problem, though, for this is that the one in Platonism is absolutely simple. It's an absolutely simple, indivisible monad, or one. And that starting point, that one, is the source from which all multiplicity, all the particulars come. So at some point there was some fission, some fracture, some divide. This would be comparable to a Platonic version of the fall in Christian theology, that brought about multiplicity, and this is ultimately a bad thing. Christian theology does not say that. It says quite the opposite, that multiplicity is no more good or evil than unity. So we believe in a balance between the one and the many. Both are good. And in this regard, we believe that the ultimate, highest absolute is both one and many. So God is one, and he's also three: Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And so this triune personal God that we believe in, we would say is the ultimate reconciliation of the dialectical tension position that Platonism and, say, Far Eastern thought has. Far Eastern thought has different dialectics between dualities, dualism, and so the one and the many are in tension there. In Platonism, there's a similar idea of the tension between the many. The many are always striving, and there's this impetus to go back to the one, and then to sort of lose particularity and distinction in the one, in the absolute. And this, of course, again, is an impersonal absolute. It's a principle, like the number one. Christian theology is very different. It says, even though there are some similarities in ideas there, Christian theology says that the multiplicity that we experience in the world is not a bad thing. There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with gradations of existence, levels of being, levels of reality. There's nothing inherently defective or bad about that. And there's also nothing inherently defective or bad about progress or change or flux. The level of existence that we live in now, presently, in this fallen world, is not the world that is the final state. It's a progressive. It's a progressive realization of God's divine immanence in the world coming to fruition. And so we believe that this will ultimately be experienced in the eternal state in the resurrection. And the resurrection is not just the resurrection of human bodies, it's also the renewal and transfiguration of the entire cosmos, because we believe that the entire cosmos was affected by the fall of man. So, and that's because God put man as sort of the steward and priest of creation. So when man fell, it affected the entire cosmos, and his rebellion with Satan brought about death, decay, destruction, entropy, so forth. So death and the level of existence that we inhabit now is not the final or ultimate state of things. It is a sort of a side road to get to a greater state. So God is able to bring greater good even out of evil itself. So we don't believe that evil has any kind of substantial ontological being or substance or existence. Evil is specifically a moral decision of the will moving against the good. Right? So being itself, all that exists, creation, created matter, created beings, these are all good in themselves. Most of the other world religions do not believe that there's evil. They would see it either as a sort of illusory, something that's a figment of man's imagination, or they would see it as a dualistic principle, say in Zoroastrianism, where you have two eternal principles of good and evil, always and perpetually, eternally fighting it out. Christian theology does not hold to that. It holds to a terminus for the period in which evil is allowed or permitted to operate. And we also don't believe that ultimately everything returns to the one and blends back into it. This, unfortunately, is something that Western theology ended up giving into with Aquinas and the beatific vision, where in the beatific vision the soul ascends back to staring into the divine essence for all eternity. And we don't believe that. We believe that we know nothing of the divine essence and we never will. We will, however, perpetually participate in the divine energies. What Platonism calls the emanations from the one could roughly be likened to the divine energies, but more accurately, we would say that the attributes of God, God's wisdom, God's knowledge, God's love, so forth, those are the things that we call divine energies. And this is a term used in Scripture. Paul speaks of the energeia in the Greek, the energies of the Spirit. Those for us would roughly be similar to Platonism's ideas of the emanations. But it's important again to make some more distinctions here. Christian theology does not believe that the one is an impersonal force that accidentally, through some sort of spilling over or fission or who knows what, gave birth to the dyad and the triad and then all the multiplicities of existence. We believe that God is a personal being, and that God created the multiplicities of the world intentionally. So it has an intentional, rational design to it. It was not an accidental, chaotic explosion. It wasn't a mistake. It was all designed and intended to be, that is, we're speaking here prior to the fall, what's called in theology prelapsarian theology. Post-lapsarian would be post-fall. So prior to the fall of man in Genesis 3, the existence of the universe was in a higher state. So man and the animals and the angelic entities were in harmony. The creation reflected perfectly the divine energies of God in man's mind. When man perceived the world, he perceived all things in God, and he perceived God in all things. And when he fell, there was a sort of fission or rupture between the higher spiritual realm and our realm. That, however, does not mean that the realm in which we inhabit is inherently evil. Matter, atoms, so forth, the energy in our realm did not take on any kind of substantial evil. There's nothing bad about trees and rocks and plants. However, in Platonism, we have the location of the bad or evil ultimately in the metaphysics of our world itself. Okay, so plants, rocks, these are further away from being, and there's a lot more non-being going on with rocks than there is going on with mind. And then for Plato, ultimately thought is a much higher realm than anything that's gross and quote material. We don't see a dialectical tension that's appropriate there, and that's why for Christian theology the idea of God becoming incarnate, at the second person of the Trinity, the Logos, in Greek terminology, which is the Word of God, the thought expression of God, the thought expression of the logic of God, the Logos, that John uses in John 1:1. In the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. That expression of God is equal to God. He is a separate person, but he is not anything lesser than God. So the Logos for us is sort of the ground and principle of all creation. And so what Platonism calls the forms or the archetypes of patterns of things, we call the logoi, Logoi, and that is plural for logos, and it is the archetypes and principles and seeds of all things that exist in potentia in our realm, that properly seen we would see and reflect, they would reflect to us the divine. However, because we're fallen, we do not see that, and we see them as they appear to us. We see the world as, dead rocks, dead matter, etc. And that's why, of course, this worldview is so diametrically opposed and opposite to the worldview of scientific reductionism and reductionistic materialism. That's pretty much the polar opposite of what we would say. So what Sherrard is getting at here then, with that sort of brief overview of theology, is the idea that for Platonism there has to be this clear mirror between the highest level of reality in the one and the what he calls the metaphysical order, and the order of logic, that is, that humans participate in their reasoning. So human reasoning, in terms of, say, geometry, mathematics, logic, and so forth, have to have a clear parallel to the one, or the realm, the metaphysical realm. We think that is not the case necessarily, right? So even though we, to a degree, understand divine logic or God's reasoning or so forth, or the logoi, so forth, the principles behind things, we do not have a total picture of this, okay? So if we were to liken this to what I was getting at in the first article, the first talk, or the first half of this talk, in the same way that there is an indeterminate aspect to these systems, likewise we don't have the totality picture of the divine or the metaphysical realm, and so therefore we cannot make a complete correlation between, say, the wisdom of God and the wisdom that we have in the natural world. We would say that we as humans do participate in a participatory, real, metaphysical way in the divine wisdom that God has, but there is never a complete totality that we have of that, right? And that's, again, because God is infinite and we're finite. So that limiting factor is something that we believe is we need to accept in humility before God, rather than the rationalist approach of Platonism that believes that because our minds are mirrors of the divine mind, we can therefore have some sort of clear correspondence between the two, right? So, in other words, God must conform to the laws of logic as I understand them, right? We would say no. Platonists would say that, quote-unquote, God, whatever the one, the monad is, has to have some degree of clear correspondence. Now, we do think, again, we do know God, we do. Here's a better analogy that Gregory of Nyssa gives us between, let's say, an individual. An individual is a person, we believe, who has a common human nature, and these are precise philosophical and theological terms in Eastern theology. So between you and I, listener, there is a common human nature that we share that is universal. But what distinguishes us is our particular persons, or hypostasis in Greek terminology. So you are the hypostasis Bob, whoever you are. I am the person hypostasis J, and we have a common humanity between us, human nature. So there's a universal and there's a particular at work here. And when we want to understand an analogy, say for divine energies, if I build a house, it's my own personal energy that goes into that house. And when I finish the house and you come and inspect it, I furnish it with my couch and all my cool stuff. You can learn things about me, right? So there's an object that I've built, and you learn about me from it, but you don't directly know me necessarily from it. And I'm also distinct from the action of building the house, right? I'm a distinct hypostasis, not the same thing as the act of doing and building the house. Well, in the same way, God created the world. We can learn about God from the world, but God is not the same thing as the world. And so in the same way, God's action is not the same thing as God. So the act of creating, so forth, these are different. These are different from the person or hypostasis who did the act. And these are important philosophical and theological distinctions, because they come to play when we try to understand, say, anthropology, or when we try to understand theology. These are sort of starting points for distinguishing what we think about things from, say, Platonism. So Platonism, even though it at times uses the term hypostasis and so forth, the ideas are very different in Platonism. The structure of Platonism is more like a sort of a mystical, maybe even Pythagorean geometry, where the geometric forms and structures of the created world are mirrors of the forms of the monad. But the problem is that if the monad is absolutely one, then the distinctions that we experience in our realm can't be accurate representations of what's in the one, right? Because the one is absolutely simple. So distinction is illusory in the one, and just somehow happens to be a phenomenon that we experience in our realm. So if we were Platonists, we could see how pretty quickly Platonism would devolve into something like Buddhism, or some form of Far Eastern thought where the absolute is a completely indistinguishable, wholly other one. So this is, you hear this kind of stuff in Far Eastern thought about, you need to escape from your particularity and dissolve into the great absolute, dissolve into the ocean of boundless being or non-being, I should say. You need to achieve thusness with the one. So we would absolutely reject any ideas that pertain to the ego, the self, the individual, the person needing to be extinguished or annihilated. That's ultimately we would say a satanic idea, right? I mean, might as well kill yourself, right? I'm not saying that Buddhism necessarily says you have to kill yourself, because it says not to harm. I understand all that, but what I'm getting at is just the metaphysical principle at work there of the idea that the individual needs to cease to be and move into some other form of existence where there's no longer individuality or particularity. We would say is a bogus and faulty philosophy. And one way to show that this is faulty, for example, is to say, similar to the determinist fallacy that I gave in the first half. If we were to say, and I've mentioned this before, if we were to say that, you need to understand that, the true path is to, escape particularity and dissolve into the one. And, I would say in response, well, now wait a minute. So you would say that this is the, sort of the ultimate, realization, of mystical truth in your worldview. Yes, it is. You need to meditate, dissolve yourself away into the one, and release yourself from the realm of particularity, because it's trap. Soma sema, the body is a prison. Well, I would say, so in this process, do you believe that it is the one realizing itself? Yes, absolutely. That is the Platonic mystery. That the one, this whole process is our return to the one, our ascent back to the monad, and ultimately it is the one realizing itself in a mirror. So if it's the one realizing itself in a mirror, then you have not ultimately discovered this truth, because the truth that you think you've discovered is actually just the one discovering itself. All right, so it's very similar to the process of the flaw in the materialist worldview, where the materialist says that he's come to the great truth of materialism, and then you point out that, well, you didn't actually discover that truth. That's actually just a predetermined chemical process. Right. So it's similar, right? In Platonism, you didn't actually discover that particularity is an illusion. You discovered, the one discovered this in the process of discovering itself, right? And so your discovery of the illusion of particularity is thus illusory. So anytime we encapsulate or encompass all of reality into some sort of determined absolute philosophic statement like that, all reality is illusion, or all particularity is illusion, all reality is material, all of which is completely impossible to actually demonstrate. But setting that aside, anytime we encapsulate the absolute, or our ultimate metaphysical principle, or our starting point, presupposition, whatever, anytime we encapsulate it in some sort of completely enclosed universal claim like that, we immediately find ourselves trapped in a bunch of ridiculous absurdities, right? Now, sometimes these views will say, well, I have no problem with ridiculous absurdities, right? And they'll say, that's part of the illusion, right? It's all part of the illusion. Well, again, if it's all part of the illusion, then your discovery of it being part of the illusion is part of the illusion, and that's the problem. All right, so that is actually a contradiction, and that's very distinct from a paradox, and that's a key point to make here. So, as Eastern theologians, we have no problem with paradox. In fact, we believe that paradox mystery is really at the heart of the world, and this does not mean that we don't have certainty or that we don't learn about the world, but that we were always in the progress, right? It's an eternal progress of learning and coming to greater certainty, coming to greater levels of knowledge, coming to a greater understanding of the divine and so forth, of God himself, but never exhausting it, right? Because that's who God is. God is the ultimate. God is the absolute, but he's also the personal absolute, and we will never absolutely exhaust him any more than, if you were to think about, a friend, a loved one, you've known these people for years. Do you know everything about them? Do you know all their thoughts? Do you know everything in their soul? No, of course not. So if we can't even make sense of this in terms of another human being, obviously we can't try to, encapsulate God into some sort of, descriptive statement or categorize God like he's some sort of thing, right? So birds, plants, trees, and then there's this thing God over here. No, we believe God is much greater than that. So that's the distinction that Sherrard is getting at here with confronting the Platonist and the Platonist views and claims of things. Platonism also can't have evil. Evil can't be something real or to be opposed. It again has to sort of fall into some kind of Far Eastern type of view that evil is just illusory, right? So too bad there's evil elites raping kids. That's just the one working itself out. No, we would say that those things are wicked and they are to be opposed, and we believe that there's a basis to oppose those things, and that's in divine law. Those things need to stop, and ultimately they will. For Platonism, we don't really have any reason as to how or why something is objectively wrong. Sherrard goes on to say it is because of this that the theologians deny the laws of logic can be applied to the formulations of divine truth in the way that the Platonists apply them. In other words, the presuppositions underlying the theologian's line of reasoning is directly opposed to that of the Platonist. The Platonists maintain that ultimately nothing in metaphysical reality contradicts the laws of logic. Theologians maintain that ultimately there is something in this reality which contradicts the laws of logic, however subtle and refined these things may be. I wouldn't use the word contradiction here. I mean, I think Sherrard's making a point here. He's saying that, to the Platonists it would appear to be a contradiction. I think it would be better to use the word paradox, because ultimately we would say, that whatever God does, whatever's happening, from the divine perspective, it's not contradictory. It may seem contradictory to the human mind, but it is rather supra-rational rather than contradictory. Theologians, of course, cannot demonstrate the validity of their presupposition more than the Platonists can demonstrate the validity of theirs. This is where I would disagree with Sherrard, because even though he's hitting on transcendental argument or presuppositional argument, he doesn't really come out with it. I would disagree with this and say that a theologian can demonstrate the validity of his presupposition as opposed to the Platonist presupposition. How do we do that? Through transcendental arguments. Indeed, unless both Platonists and theologians are to admit their adherence to the opposing presuppositions underlying their lines of reasoning as arbitrary, they must affirm that ultimately the presuppositions are matters of faith deriving from or rooted in different forms of revelation. Now this is kind of true, because I would agree, and those who affirm the validity of transcendental arguments or presuppositionalism in theology affirm this. We say that ultimately we are all operating on some form of circularity, right? And so that's because we can't ultimately have what in philosophy is called a classical foundationalist epistemology. We can't have some axiom that is self-evident and self-referencing as a starting point that we can't itself ask, how does that axiom work, right? And this is the fault of classical and medieval, or say Thomistic reasoning, is that it's a foundationalist epistemology. You start with these self-evident truths like, say, the law of non-contradiction, and then you build the rest of your epistemology on that. Well, the problem is that I can ask the question, how does the law of non-contradiction work, right? And what Gödel showed was that there are truths outside of axiomatic systems that the system itself can't prove, right? And that goes to prove classical foundationalist epistemology wrong. So in other words, Gödel disproves, say, Thomism or Aristotelian logic because it shows that those systems themselves must again appeal outside of themselves to show the truthfulness of the system itself. Aristotle, amazingly, as I pointed out many times, is the first to propose a transcendental argument, for the law of non-contradiction itself. Against the sophist in his book, The Metaphysics, he says, the sophist asked me, how do I know that the law of non-contradiction is true? Right? So he said, how can I prove that? He says, by transcendental argument. Now, I don't think he uses that word, but that's what he's doing. He says, by the impossibility of the contrary. If I were to deny the laws of logic and say that they are illogical, I am presupposing the laws of logic in their denial. Right? And that constitutes one of the strongest forms of proof for logic that we can have. Likewise, if we were to, when we apply Sherrard's point, he comes right up to the precipice of where I'm at, where I want to go, and he just kind of stops and lingers there. He says, well, how are we going to compare the presuppositions of the Platonists to the presuppositions of the Christian? We can't really, since they both have their own starting points. They both have their own inner working separate systems. And my argument is to say, no, we can go further. And interestingly, in Sherrard's essay, Tradition and the Traditions, when he is asked the question, how do you know that Hinduism is false, having never been a Hindu, he uses a transcendental argument. So he's doing what I'm talking about. He says, well, I know that Hinduism isn't true as opposed to Christian theology because I can boil both down to their ultimate starting points, their ultimate absolute, their overarching metaphysical principle, objective metaphysical principle. And for Hinduism, it's an impersonal absolute. For theology, biblical theology, it's a personal absolute. And so when we look at the implications of those two starting points for theology, one of them leads to a dead end and a bunch of baloney, nonsense, saying Hinduism, when we have an absolute that is impersonal. When we compare that to a personal deity or God that's absolute, we have a much more coherent and sensible, rational position, and in fact a position that makes rationality possible, whereas the other position as a whole ends in complete irrationality and complete incoherence. And that's really the crux of it, right? So all positions, like I talked about in my last talk, the atheism William Lane Craig talk, all positions, all worldviews can be boiled down in this way, right? And so for most world religions, the absolute, so be it Platonism, Hinduism, Far Eastern religions, etc., even we can throw in atheism and materialism, all of those camps can be grouped together under one heading, wherein the ultimate absolute, the ultimate principle, even if they deny there is one, right, it would still be sort of an unknown, chaotic, impersonal. It's all under impersonalism, right? The ultimate principle, be it deity, whatever, is impersonal. It's a chaotic, unguided, random destiny, right? I must say the pagans, fortune, o fortuna. There's no sentient, rational agent that is guiding the totality of reality. And for the Christian theologian, for biblical theology, that is the case. There is a divine mind that is guiding things, that is the ground of things, and that is leading things towards a terminus. And so history has a beginning, a middle, and an end, and therefore is meaningful. Also, in all these other views, history is relativized. History is absolutized. And so the here and now is all there is, and that's why we end up with pagan cyclical views, or say Nietzsche's cyclical return view, where we're just stuck in this wheel, right? So that's why the Hindus talk about the wheel of time that we have to escape, which is very similar to Platonism's idea of the transmigration of the souls, and we gotta get out of this realm because it's the problem. Well, theology in the biblical sense It's not this realm that's the problem. It's not some group over there that's the problem. It's our own heart that is the problem. We need to change. We need to have a change of mind, metanoia in the Greek, or a repentance of mind, and turn back to God and what He teaches us in order to properly interpret the world and in order to properly live. Otherwise, we are heading towards our own self-destruction. So that's the narrative of the biblical theological approach, as opposed to the approaches of, say, other religions where reality is illusory, it is impersonal, it is ultimately meaningless, it is ultimately chaotic, and etc. And that really, I think, sums up the big distinction between Platonism and biblical theology. And so Sherrard ends it by saying, indeed, one may say that for the theologians, the Platonic assumption that the ultimate form in which divine truth can be conceived on the human plane is not paradoxical, but logical, represents a kind of revolt of the lower or logical faculty of the human intelligence against the higher or supra-logical faculty. The revolt is not unconnected in their thought with the fall of man, and it should be recalled that in paradise the human intelligence is regarded as operating in a supra-logical angelic manner. Right, so again, that's what I was getting at a minute ago, that for us, the natural state, the proper state, is the way things were in Eden, where we were seeing things in God and seeing God in all things. Right, so our consciousness was in a higher state. It participated in a greater degree in divine grace and divine illumination, and our logical and reasoning faculties were subjected to divine law in the proper way, and so the world was interpreted correctly. Since the fall, that's all out of whack, and so we need God, we need divine revelation to put things back into order. Right, so we're not out of whack, and we're not led about by deceptions and phantasms and lies and so forth. And that's what Sherrard's getting at, is that Platonism, even though it might have elements of truth here and there, ultimately is a version of this rebellion of the logical faculty against the higher faculty in man, which we call the nous, N-O-U-S, which is the divine faculty that God gave us for knowing Him. And for us, the nous is not intellectual, it is the heart. Right? So rather than there being a divide between the mind and the heart, for us there is a unity there that is to be achieved, so that logic is not divorced from feeling or from love and so forth. And we believe that in the eschaton, in the eternal state, this joining back together of the faculties will happen. So we believe that man has a third faculty that is not just his logic and intellect, and not just his heart or emotions or soul, but is also his nous. And the nous is the combination of these two together knowing God. Right? So humans have a tendency to split apart things that actually should be united and working together. And this is, if you've heard different occult guys even talk about this, Hermetic people talk about this at times, and they're hitting on something accurate, say between the right side of the brain and artistic faculties, and the left side of the brain, analytic, mathematical faculties. These are actually, through the bridge between the two hemispheres, supposed to be working together, right? And in the same way, we would say that man's intellect and reasoning should be functioning together with his heart and his emotions and his love, compassion, etc. And these together function to know God through a higher faculty, which is the nous, which is able to perceive God. Okay, but we believe that through the fall, through lies, through obeying unruly passions, that we can actually darken the nous, Right? So the faculty that we have for seeing God in the world and seeing the world in God is darkened by this over time. And so returning to God is the way that we begin to open the noose and see things properly. And so that's why we would say that when, say, Paul in the New Testament says that man is body, soul, and spirit, we think that he's talking about the noose. You have the body, you have the soul, and you have the noose. Western theology with Augustine and Thomism rejected that tripartite view and accepted a strictly dual view of man, where the mind, soul, psyche, and intellect are essentially all the same thing. And then that's set over against the body. So in Augustine, there's a clear body-soul dialect. And for Aquinas, the intellect is just merely some faculty of the mind, some reasoning faculty of the psyche. There is no higher nous at all. So that's completely absent from Western theology. It's a distinctive feature of Eastern anthropology. And we believe that's very important because it's actually the means by which we see and know God. So it's supra-logical, right? It's not contradictory, this level of reality. And that's how we would say that when we see the world and we see things in God, we believe that the fundamental archetypal principles of things, say that Werner Heisenberg talked about when he said that fundamental reality is at base like Platonic forms, geometrical structures. It's not, quote, matter. It's just energy in different forms, right? So at that level, these forms, these principles, we would say, ultimately they're just manifestations of the logos. They're the logoi in creation. I'm not saying, by the way, that like I mystically can look at a chair and see the subatomic particles. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that anything that we look at in creation at whatever level is to be seen in God, and there's just an illustrative telling fact from Heisenberg when he talks about the subatomic level of things having this clear structure, this geometric and Platonic and mathematic. It's not, quote, physical. It shows that what we're talking about makes a lot more sense than any of these other views, and that's really the crux of the matter. So that concludes. Like I said, I had requests for this kind of a talk again, so we will get back to Plato for sure in the next talk. Absolutely, I promise. And thank you for listening. And hopefully these articles have been enlightening, and we can delve further into these great mysteries. Thank you.